The land doesn't move. That's the foundational assumption of everything I do. The bedrock principle, and I mean that literally. Stone doesn't shift. Ridgelines don't migrate. The coordinates I record today will match the coordinates someone recorded 100 years ago, within acceptable tolerance. That's not an opinion. That's physics. The ridge on the Hendrick property measured 14 feet further east than the 1991 legal survey. Not 14 inches. Not a rounding error in the old equipment. 14 feet. I checked my instrument 3 times. I recalibrated from the benchmark. I called my equipment supplier and had them walk me through every possible source of mechanical error. The instrument was fine. The ridge had moved. This is red state horror. Stay with me. I've been a licensed land surveyor for 14 years. Before that, I was a survey technician for 6 years. Before that, I had a semester of engineering school that I didn't take, and a winter working trails for the Forest Service that taught me more about topography than any classroom could have. I know land. Western North Carolina is complicated survey territory. The mountains fold in ways that flat country surveyors find disorienting. A property line that runs due west on paper runs up a 40-degree slope in practice. Elevation changes that look like nothing on a map are 800 feet of vertical climb when you're carrying equipment. I've worked in it for a decade. I know its particular difficulties. The job that brought me to Yancey County in October of 2022 was a boundary dispute. Standard enough on paper. A family named Hendrick owned a ridge property, 43 acres, mostly timber, with some cleared pasture at the lower elevation. Their neighbor to the east, a man named Galt, was claiming the boundary line had been misrecorded in the original deed. Galt said the ridge was his. The Hendrick said the 1991 survey settled it. My job was to resurvey the boundary and produce a certified legal document that one of them could use in court. I'd read the 1991 survey before I came out. Standard practice. You familiarize yourself with the prior work so you understand what you're verifying. The 1991 survey was done by a man named Elbert Voss. I didn't know him personally, but I knew his reputation. He'd been one of the better surveyors in the county, retired now, still alive at 81 and living in Burnsville. His work was clean, precise notation, careful benchmarking, the kind of survey you look at and feel confident about. The Hendrick property sits at about 3,800 feet in elevation. The ridge that forms its eastern boundary runs roughly north-south for about 600 yards, a hard granite spine that sticks up from the mountain like a fin. You can see it from the road. You can see it from the next county on a clear day. It is not the kind of thing that is difficult to locate. The first day I was on the property, I was doing what I always do at the start of a survey, establishing control. You find the benchmarks, permanent markers, usually brass caps set in concrete or bedrock, and you verify your starting position against known coordinates. GPS, total station, level. You triangulate from multiple sources until you're confident in your baseline. The benchmarks on the Hendrick property were exactly where Elbert Voss had recorded them. This is important. The benchmarks hadn't moved. They were within 2 centimeters of their recorded positions, which is normal drift for 30 years of frost heave and settling. So the benchmarks were right. My instrument was calibrated to the benchmarks. My GPS was confirming against the satellite. Everything agreed. I started working the line from the southern benchmark north, toward the ridge. A survey line is straightforward in concept. You set your instrument, you shoot a bearing, you walk that bearing, you set a rod at a point, and you record the distance and elevation. Then you move forward and do it again. And again. Until you reach the terminus. It takes time. It requires concentration. But it isn't complicated. I was making good progress toward the ridge when I noticed something. A flagging stake. Orange, like mine. The kind of surveyor who uses LD, the plastic, was UV, faded to near white at the top. The orange was only still visible close to the soil, Elbert Voss's stake. 30 years old, exactly on my calculated line, which meant I was walking in the right direction. I found 4 more of his stakes on the way up. Every one of them was exactly where my calculations said they should be. Every one of them confirmed that I was on the correct line. And then I reached the ridge. And I stopped, and I looked at my total station. And I looked at the ridge, and I looked at my total station again. The ridge was 14 feet east of where it should be. I want to explain what 14 feet means in this context, because you might hear that and think measurement error, instrument calibration, something in the GPS, some drift in the coordinate system. These are reasonable explanations, and I thought of all of them. A modern total station has a linear accuracy of about 1 to 2 millimeters per 100 meters. Over the distance I was working, from my benchmark to the ridge, the maximum accumulated error should have been under 2 centimeters. Not 14 feet, not 427 centimeters. I recalibrated my instrument from scratch. reset the orientation, reshot my backside to the benchmark. The benchmark was still exactly where it should be. The ridge was still 14 feet east of the 1991 recorded position. I couldn't get a reliable cell signal on the ridge. I hiked back down to where I'd parked, sat in my truck, and called my equipment supplier. I described the discrepancy. I walked them through my setup, my calibration procedure, and my benchmark verification. They asked me to describe the terrain. I described it. They said carefully that 14 feet of discrepancy in a properly calibrated instrument on verified benchmarks was not something they had an explanation for. They suggested I try the next morning again with fresh batteries and a full recalibration in cooler temperatures. I said I would. That night, I pulled up the 1991 survey on my laptop in the motel in Burnsville. I went through Elbert Voss's fieldwork notes page by page. His measurements were internally consistent. His benchmark positions matched what I'd found. His traverse from the south benchmark to the ridge terminus recorded a total horizontal distance of 412 feet. I had measured 426 feet. 14 feet more. Not because my instrument was reading long. I'd verified that. 14 feet more because the ridge was 14 feet further away than it had been in 1991. I sat with that for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and tried to sleep. The second morning, I was on the ridge by 7. I brought a second GPS receiver, a handheld unit I keep as a backup. Independent system, independent satellite acquisition. No shared calibration with my primary instrument. I set up my total station on the same benchmark position as the day before. I initialized my backup GPS independently and let it acquire satellites for 15 minutes before I read a position. Both instruments agreed with each other. Both instruments agreed with the benchmark. Both instruments agreed that the ridge was 14 feet further east than Elbert Voss had recorded it. I spent 4 hours on that ridge. I shot the terminus from 6 different instrument positions. I triangulated from both benchmarks simultaneously, which you rarely need to do but which eliminates any possibility of a single point error propagating through the traverse. Every measurement agreed. By midday, I had more survey data on that 600-yard ridge than most boundary lines accumulate in their entire legal history, and every piece of it said the same thing. The ridge was 14 feet east of its 1991 position. I have a rule about anomalies. When the data shows you something you can't explain, you don't discard the data. You don't average it away. You don't file it under measurement error and move on. You find the explanation, because there is always an explanation. Landslides can move ridge material, but not a granite spine. Not without leaving catastrophic evidence visible from the road. I'd seen nothing. Glacial isostatic rebound, the land rising as ancient ice sheets retreat, is real and measurable, but it operates on timescales of centuries and produces vertical movement, not horizontal. And it doesn't move ridges. Tectonic activity in the southern Appalachians is minimal and produces fractions of millimeters per year. There is no geological mechanism by which a granite ridgeline moves 14 feet east in 30 years. I drove back to Burnsville. I found Elbert Voss's home address in the county directory, and I called him. I want to stop here for just a moment. If you've made it this far into this story, you're the reason I keep telling it. Drop the word boundary in the comments. I read everyone, and it matters more than you know. If you're new here, subscribe. New stories every Thursday night. I'll be back next week, and I'll have something waiting for you. Now, where were we? Elbert Voss immediately remembered the Hendrick survey. He said that ridge, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask about it. I told him what I'd found. I gave him the numbers. 14 feet, 2 independent instruments, 6 instrument positions, all consistent. He didn't say anything long enough for me to think the call had dropped. Then he said, I know. He told me he'd gone back to the Hendrick property in 1998. 7 years after his original survey, he'd been in the area doing another job, and he'd walked the ridgeline on his way back just, he said, out of habit. The way surveyors do. Looking at land. He said the ridge had been in the wrong place. Not 14 feet. Not that much. 3 feet, he thought. Maybe 4. He'd told himself he was misremembering the original survey. That his eye was off. That he was getting old. He hadn't gone back again. I asked him if he'd documented it. He was quiet again. He said, there are things you document and things you don't. I sat in my truck outside his house for a long time after that call. Here is what the math now suggests. In 1991, the ridge was at position X. In 1998, Elbert Voss estimated it was 3 to 4 feet east of X. In 2022, I measured it at 14 feet east of X. If you draw a line through those 3 points, 1991, 1998, and 2022, the movement isn't constant. It's accelerating. Slow at first, then faster. The ridge was moving east. and it was moving faster every year. I should have filed my report and gone home. I had enough data. More than enough. The resurvey would show a discrepancy with the 1991 document. I would note it as an anomaly, flag it for the court, recommend independent verification, and let the attorneys sort out what it meant for the boundary dispute. That's the professional thing to do. I went back to the ridge that night. I don't fully know why. Some version of the same impulse that makes you press on a bruise. The need to confirm the impossible with your own senses when instruments aren't enough. Without equipment, I couldn't measure anything. I knew that. What I could do was stand on the ridge and look west, back toward the benchmark, and try to feel the distance in my body. Surveyors develop a physical sense of measurement over time. You walk 100 feet enough times, and you know what it feels like. The length of your stride, the time it takes, and the way it sits in your legs. I stood on the ridge, and I looked west, and I thought, it's too far. Not 14 feet too far. I couldn't measure that with my body. But so far, the room feels larger when you walk into it than it looked from the doorway. I stood there for a while, in the wind, in the dark, and then I became aware of something. The ridge was vibrating, not shaking, not trembling, vibrating, the way a tuning fork vibrates. A frequency you feel in your feet and your chest before you identify it as sound. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped, and the ridge was just a ridge again. Cold granite and wind, and the distant lights of Burnsville far below. I walked back down the mountain. I drove to the motel. I filed my report in the morning. I documented the discrepancy. 14 feet. I noted Elbert Voss's 1998 informal observation. I flagged the anomaly as requiring independent geological review. I recommended that the court seek expert testimony on whether the discrepancy had legal implications for the boundary designation. I included all my data. I did not include the vibration. You don't file what you can't measure. The Hendrick boundary dispute was settled 8 months later. The court accepted my survey. The boundary was re-recorded at the new position. Galt got a narrow strip of land along the base of the ridge. The Hendricks kept the timber rights. As far as the legal record is concerned, the matter is closed. I've thought about this case more than any other in my career. Not because of what I measured. I've come to a cold peace with the measure. Numbers don't lie. The ridge was 14 feet further east than it was in 1991. That is true regardless of whether there is any mechanism to explain it. What I think about is Elbert Voss, an 81-year-old man who noticed something impossible on a ridge in 1998 and made a decision to leave it alone. Who carried that quiet anomaly for 24 years. Who, when I called him with the same numbers multiplied by time, said, I know. Like he'd been waiting, like he'd known someone would eventually call. He died in March of 2023. 5 months after I filed my report. I don't know if he ever went back to that ridge. I like to think he didn't. I went back once more in October of 2023, exactly 1 year after my original survey. I told myself I was in the area on another job, which was true enough. I didn't bring instruments. I just stood on the ridge for a few minutes and looked west. And I thought, it's further than it was. I can't prove that. I had no equipment. It was an impression, not a measurement, but I've walked the land for 20 years, and the ridge felt further away than it did 12 months ago. I drove home. I haven't been back, but I pull up the coordinates sometimes, late at night, on my laptop. The legal record, the new boundary, the numbers are now the official truth of that land, and I wonder what the numbers will say in another 30 years. Whether whoever runs that survey will call me the way I called Elbert Voss. Whether I'll know what to tell them. I've been turning that ridge over in my head for 2 years now. Land is supposed to be the constant. It's the reference point. It's the one thing in this world that everything else is supposed to move around. When you're a surveyor, you build your entire life on that assumption. You stake houses on it, roads, fences, generations of property lines. You trust that what you measure today will still be there tomorrow. But here's what that ridge taught me. Certainty isn't the same thing as permanence. We all build our lives on things we assume don't move. Careers, relationships, beliefs, the lines we draw around who we are and what we own. We assume they're granite. We assume they're fixed. And sometimes, slowly enough that no one notices at first, they shift. Not because we were careless, not because we mismeasured, but because change doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it just hums under your feet for 10 seconds in the dark. And then it waits. I still believe in physics. I still believe in measurement. But I also know this now. If something doesn't make sense, pretending it didn't happen won't stabilize it. You can either measure it honestly, or you can look away and let it keep moving. I don't know which choice is safer, so I'll leave you with this tonight. If you went back to that ridge next year and it was another 5 feet east, would you document it? Or would you decide there are things better left unmeasured? And here's another one I've been thinking about. If the foundation of something you've trusted your whole life started shifting slowly beneath you, would you notice? Or would you wait for someone else to call and tell you? Have you ever measured something twice and gotten 2 different answers, and both times you were right? I've been turning that over for 2 years now. I don't think there's anywhere left to put it. Drop boundary in the comments if you made it all the way through. I want to know who's still standing on the ridge with me. And tell me, what's something in your life you thought would never move, but did? This is Red State Horror. I'll see you next Thursday.